My husband's mistress announced their engagement at our anniversary dinner. He thought he'd destroyed me, thought I'd crumble and fade away. Instead, I watched him celebrate his victory until I revealed I owned his precious company and everything he'd bragged about building was actually mine to take away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal champagne flute trembled in my hand, tiny ripples disturbing the golden liquid as my husband Marcus rose to give his anniversary toast. 15 years of marriage, he proclaimed to our gathered friends and colleagues, his voice carrying across the private dining room of Le Jardin, the most exclusive restaurant in the city. I watched him closely, noting how his hand kept straying to adjust his Hermes tie, a nervous tell I'd learned to read years ago. Something was off. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Marcus was too polished tonight, too calculated in his movements. Even the way he'd insisted on this lavish celebration seemed forced, especially given his usual disregard for our anniversary. I took a small sip of champagne, letting the bubbles dance on my tongue as I studied the faces around the table. That's when I noticed her. Victoria Chen, his new marketing director, seated 3 places down. She was watching him with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Her perfectly manicured fingers toyed with something in her lap, hidden beneath her crisp linen napkin. I'd seen that nervous gesture before, in board meetings when executives were about to make career-defining presentations. Elizabeth has been by my side through everything, Marcus continued, his practiced smile never quite reaching his eyes. Through the early struggles of building Turner International from the ground up, through every success and setback, I felt my lips curve into a smile that matched his in insincerity. If only he knew. The company he so proudly claimed to have built had been mine since before we'd met. My father's legacy, entrusted to me when he passed, with the strict instruction to keep the ownership private until I was ready to take the reins publicly. Marcus had never questioned why a small consulting firm had hired him as CEO with such generous terms. His ego wouldn't allow him to look too closely at his good fortune. And now? Marcus paused, his eyes flickering to Victoria for just a moment. Too long. As we celebrate 15 years together, I want to thank everyone for being here to share this special evening. The pause that followed felt endless. Victoria shifted in her seat, her hand tightening around whatever she held beneath the table. I watched as she gave Marcus a slight nod, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. My heart rate didn't quicken, my breath didn't catch. Instead, a strange calm settled over me as I realized what was about to happen. Actually, Victoria's voice cut through the quiet, clear, and confident as she stood. Marcus has something else he'd like to share. She withdrew her hand from beneath the napkin, and a diamond ring caught the light, sending prismatic reflections dancing across the white tablecloth. The room collectively held its breath. I could feel the weight of all eyes darting between Victoria, Marcus, and me. Their horror, their morbid fascination, their anticipation of the drama about to unfold. Marcus stood straighter, squaring his shoulders like he did before hostile takeover announcements. "Elizabeth and I have grown apart," he began, his voice taking on that same tone he used when firing long-term employees. "We've been living separate lives for years, and it's time to be honest with everyone. Victoria and I are in love. We're getting married as soon as the divorce is finalized." The silence that followed was deafening. Faces turned to me, expecting tears, expecting a scene. I could see Marcus tense, preparing for the hysterics he thought would follow. But 15 years of watching him in boardrooms had taught me the power of stillness, of silence. I lifted my champagne glass, took another measured sip, and smiled. Not the practiced social smile I'd worn all evening, but a genuine one that seemed to unsettle Marcus more than any outburst could have. Because in that moment, as he stood there thinking he'd orchestrated my greatest humiliation, I knew exactly how this would end. My father had always told me that timing was everything in business and in life. Wait for the moment when they're most confident, most certain of their victory, he'd said. That's when they're most vulnerable. As I set down my glass with deliberate care, I knew that moment was coming. Marcus had just made his final tactical error, and he didn't even know it. The company's annual shareholder meeting was in 3 days. Marcus had been preparing for months to announce a major restructuring, one that would have eliminated several long-term employees who still remembered when my father ran the company. How fitting that it would instead be the day he learned who really owned Turner International. I rose from my seat, smoothing the silk of my black Valentino dress. "Congratulations," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence. "I think it's time for everyone to know the truth." The drive home from Le Jardin was silent, the city lights blurring past my window like scattered stars. Marcus had left with Victoria, of course, his final power play of the evening. I sat in the back of my private car, watching raindrops race down the tinted windows, each one carrying a memory of the past 15 years. James, my driver, and one of the few people who knew my true role at Turner International, kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. He'd been my father's driver before mine, had watched me grow from a determined young heiress into the silent owner of a global empire. "Would you like me to take the scenic route, Ms. Turner?" he asked, his voice gentle with understanding. "No," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my tone. "Take me to the office instead." The city's financial district rose before us, a forest of glass and steel reaching toward the night sky. Turner International occupied the top, 15 floors of the most prestigious building, my father's vision made manifest. As we pulled into the private underground garage, I caught my reflection in the window. I expected to see devastation, tears, something that matched the scandal I'd just endured. Instead, I saw clarity. The private elevator hummed as it carried me to the top floor. At this hour, the office was empty save for the security team, who nodded respectfully as I passed. They too were part of my father's old guard, loyal to the Turner name rather than the man who currently sat in the CEO's chair. I entered my private office, officially listed as a document storage room, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled below, a glittering tapestry of lights and shadows. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably celebrating with Victoria, thinking he'd orchestrated the perfect coup. The thought didn't hurt as much as it should have. My phone buzzed incessantly. Concerned friends, board members who'd been at the dinner, gossip-hungry socialites. I ignored them all, walking instead to the hidden safe behind my father's old painting. Inside lay the document I'd never thought I'd need to use. The original ownership papers of Turner International, along with my father's letter. "My dearest Elizabeth," I read aloud, his words as clear now as they were the day he wrote them. "If you're reading this, you've decided it's time to step out of the shadows. Remember what I taught you. Power isn't in what you show, it's in what you keep hidden. When the moment comes to reveal yourself, make it count. Make it devastating. Make it a lesson they'll never forget." I settled into my leather chair, spreading the company documents across my desk. Marcus had always been so proud of his rise to CEO, boasting about how he'd been chosen to lead Turner International at such a young age. He'd never questioned why a board of directors would entrust a trillion-dollar company to someone barely out of his 30s. His ego had blinded him to the truth, that every step of his ascent had been carefully orchestrated. My father had known he was dying when he made me sole owner. "The business world isn't ready for a woman your age to take over openly," he'd said. "Let them underestimate you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let them think you're just another trust fund daughter. Watch, learn, and when you're ready, show them who you really are. I'd followed his advice, playing the role of the supportive wife perfectly. I'd attended charity galas on Marcus's arm, hosted dinner parties for his business associates, smiled and nodded as he took credit for strategies I'd suggested during pillow talk. I'd made myself invisible in plain sight, observing every decision, noting every mistake, learning every weakness in his carefully constructed facade. Opening my laptop, I began reviewing the documents for Monday's shareholder meeting. Marcus had spent months preparing for his big restructuring announcement, his plan to streamline operations by eliminating the old guard my father had put in place. He had no idea that I'd been quietly purchasing more shares through Shell companies, consolidating my already controlling interest. By Monday morning, I would own nearly 80% of Turner International's voting shares. A notification popped up on my screen, an email from Victoria to the board announcing her resignation as marketing director, effective immediately. How considerate of her to save me the trouble. I forwarded it to HR, adding a note to process. Her exit package without the customary executive bonuses. It was a small thing, but it felt good to flex those muscles again. I spent the next hour reviewing Marcus's recent decisions, seeing them now through the lens of his deception. How many of his business dinners had been with Victoria? How many company resources had he diverted to impress her? The audit would be thorough, and every misused dollar would be accounted for. Standing, I walked back to the windows. Dawn was breaking over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In a few hours, Marcus would swagger into this building, probably rehearsing how to spin last night's events to the board. He had no idea that his keycard would be deactivated, his passwords changed, his access to the executive floor revoked. My phone buzzed again, a message from Marcus himself. "We should talk about how to handle this professionally." I smiled, remembering all the times I'd watched him handle corporate takeovers. He always offered to talk professionally right before he gutted a company. But he'd never faced an opponent who knew his playbook by heart, who had spent 15 years studying his every move. "Yes," I typed back. "Let's discuss it at Monday's shareholder meeting." The weekend stretched before me like a blank canvas, every hour an opportunity to prepare for Monday's revelation. I spent Saturday morning in my home office, the space Marcus had always dismissed as my hobby room where I supposedly planned charity events. If he'd ever bothered to look closer, he might have noticed the hidden terminal accessing Turner International's secure servers, or the files detailing every major company decision of the past 15 years. My first call was to Lawrence Chen, our long-standing corporate counsel. The irony of his sharing Victoria's surname wasn't lost on me. They were distant cousins, a fact Marcus had either overlooked or ignored in his arrogance. "I saw the guest list for Monday's shareholder meeting," Lawrence said, his tone carefully neutral. "I assume you're finally ready?" "Yes," I replied, pulling up the documentation we'd prepared years ago. "Execute Protocol Artemis." There was a pause on the line, followed by the sound of rapid typing. Protocol Artemis, named after the goddess of the hunt, was a contingency plan my father had created. It involved a complex series of legal maneuvers designed to lock down the company's assets and freeze any unauthorized transfers. Marcus had no idea it existed, just as he had no idea that Lawrence's true loyalty lay with the Turner family. "It's done," Lawrence confirmed. "All major financial decisions now require dual authorization from both the CEO and the owner. Given that you're the owner, Marcus won't be able to move anything significant before Monday." Perfect. I smiled, imagining Marcus's frustration when he discovered his executive override codes suddenly required secondary approval. What about the other matter? "The private investigators' reports are quite thorough," Lawrence replied. 6 months of documentation, meetings, expenses, hotel receipts. They've been using the Milan acquisition as cover for their relationship. Every trip, every dinner, charged to the company account. I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. The Milan deal, Marcus's pride and joy, the acquisition he claimed would cement his legacy. How fitting that it would instead become evidence of his misconduct. Send copies to HR and the board's ethics committee, I instructed. But hold them until Monday morning, 1 hour before the meeting. After hanging up, I moved to my next task. Opening my laptop, I accessed the company's internal messaging system. As expected, the executive floor was buzzing with weekend activity, crisis management in full swing. Victoria had already cleared out her office, but Marcus was there, probably trying to damage control. I watched his digital footprints as he accessed file after file, attempting to move money between accounts, make last-minute changes to Monday's presentation. Each attempt met with the new security protocols, requiring an approval he couldn't obtain. His frustration was evident in the increasingly aggressive way he typed, the multiple failed override attempts. A message popped up from Diane, my father's former secretary, and now the board's administrative director. He's calling an emergency board meeting for Sunday afternoon. Claims it's about recent developments affecting company stability. Perfect, I replied. Decline due to insufficient notice. Cite bylaw 47. 3. Diane's response came with a hint of satisfaction. Already done. He's not taking it well. I spent the next few hours methodically reviewing the Milan acquisition documents. Every detail Marcus and Victoria had tried to hide was there, buried in expense reports and meeting minutes. They'd been sloppy, confident in their security clearance and Marcus's position as CEO. They hadn't considered that someone higher up might be watching. Around midnight, my phone lit up with Marcus's name. I let it ring, imagining him pacing in his office, tie loosened, hair disheveled from running his hands through it, his typical stress response. When it went to voicemail, he sent a text. The board meeting denial is ridiculous. This situation needs to be addressed before markets open Monday. You're being childish. I screenshot the message, adding it to my growing file. Classic Marcus, attempting to gaslight, to make me appear emotional and unprofessional. It had worked in our marriage, but it would fail spectacularly in the boardroom. Another text followed. Victoria and I are willing to be generous in the divorce settlement. Don't force this into a corporate issue. Generous. The word hung in the air, laden with condescension. He still thought he held all the cards, still believed he was the one with something to offer. His assumption that I would need or want his generosity would be his undoing. I opened our home security app, watching through the cameras as Marcus finally returned to collect some clothes. He moved through the house with entitled confidence, selecting his most expensive suits, his prized watches. I made note of everything he took. Evidence for the asset freeze Lawrence would implement first thing Monday morning. As he passed through the library, he paused at the photograph of my father and me at my college graduation. It was the only picture in the house that showed us at the Turner International offices, standing before the company logo. Marcus had always assumed it was taken during a casual visit, never questioning why my father's arm was draped proudly around my shoulders. As we stood in the CEO's office, his office, which would later become Marcus's, and soon would acknowledge its true owner. I watched him shake his head at the photo before leaving, no doubt dismissing it as another painful reminder of the family life he was discarding. In his rush to start his new life with Victoria, he'd forgotten the first rule of corporate takeovers. Know your opponent's true position. Monday was approaching, and with it, the moment Marcus would learn exactly who he'd been sleeping beside for 15 years. As I prepared for bed in my empty house, I felt none of the loneliness he probably expected me to suffer. Instead, I felt light, unburdened, ready for the battle ahead. Sunday unfolded with the precision of a well-orchestrated symphony. I arrived at the office before dawn, The same outfit I'd worn to the anniversary dinner now replaced with a tailored Chanel suit in deep navy, my father's favorite color for power moves. The security team nodded with newfound respect. Word had clearly spread through the old guard that the true Turner was finally emerging from the shadows. The executive floor was eerily quiet, but the digital landscape told a different story. My private terminal lit up with alerts. Marcus had spent the night attempting to access restricted servers, trying to move assets, making desperate calls to board members. Each attempt left a digital fingerprint, each call recorded in the system's logs. His panic was becoming palpable. Sarah Chen, Victoria's former assistant and my longtime informant, had sent her final report. The details were illuminating. Victoria had been planning this move for months, carefully orchestrating her announcement to coincide with the Milan deal's completion. She'd believed it would force my quick, quiet departure, leaving her perfectly positioned to step into both my roles, as wife and as the company's marketing voice. She's been practicing her new signature, Sarah noted in her report. Mrs. Victoria Turner Chen. She's already ordered personalized stationery. I allowed myself a small smile at that detail. Victoria's ambition had made her careless, had led her to celebrate her victory before ensuring her position. It was the same mistake Marcus often made in business, assuming success before the contracts were signed. A gentle knock at my office. Doctor announced Diane's arrival. She carried a stack of folders and a knowing smile. The board members have been calling all morning, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. Jonathan Pierce is particularly interested in knowing why his longtime golf partner suddenly can't access the executive accounts. Jonathan Pierce, Marcus's strongest ally on the board, and, not coincidentally, the man who'd introduced him to Victoria at last year's charity gala. The pieces were falling into place. Let them wonder, I replied, accepting the folders. Have all the necessary documents been delivered to their offices? Diane's smile widened. Every board member received a comprehensive packet this morning. By special courier. Your father would be proud. You even used his preferred delivery service. The packets contained irrefutable evidence of Marcus and Victoria's misuse of company resources, along with detailed documentation of my ownership. By now, the board members would be discovering that their CEO's authority had always been contingent on my silent approval. My phone buzzed with a text from Lawrence. Marcus is in the lobby with his personal lawyer. They're demanding access to the executive floor. Maintain protocol, I replied. No access without proper authorization. I turned to the security feeds, watching as Marcus argued with the lobby security team. His usual polished appearance was notably disheveled, his tie slightly askew, his hair showing signs of a restless night. Beside him, a man in an ill-fitting suit gesticulated, wildly, waving what appeared to be hastily printed documents. His lawyers from Caldwell and Brooks, Diane noted, peering at the screen. Third-tier firm specializes in quick divorces. Clearly, he hasn't figured out what's really happening yet. The thought was oddly satisfying. Marcus had been so focused on orchestrating my personal humiliation that he'd failed to see the larger picture forming around him. He still believed this was about our marriage, about division of assets and prenuptial agreements. He had no idea he was about to face a very different kind of legal battle. I spent the next few hours reviewing the final details for Monday's meeting. The presentation Marcus had prepared, his grand vision for restructuring the company, was still loaded on the system. I scrolled through it with mild amusement, noting how he'd planned to dismiss key employees, all while positioning himself as the company's savior. Around midday, Victoria made her own attempt to enter the building. The security footage showed her trying to use her executive access card, then becoming increasingly agitated when it was declined. She'd dressed for a power move, red blazer, stiletto heels, perfect makeup, but her composure cracked as she was politely but firmly escorted out. She's called HR 3 times, Sarah reported via secure message, demanding to know why. Her credentials have been revoked, Should I have them return her calls? No need, I replied. Everything will be clarified in tomorrow's meeting. As the day progressed, more pieces of my strategy fell into place. The private investigators delivered their final report, including photographs of Marcus and Victoria at various company-funded rendezvous. The audit team completed their review of the Milan acquisition, highlighting every questionable expense and unauthorized decision. The legal team finished preparing the documents that would restore my father's name to its rightful place in the company hierarchy. By sunset, the stage was set. I stood at my office window, watching the city lights flicker to life. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably meeting with his lawyer, planning his defense against what he thought would be a simple divorce proceeding. Victoria was likely planning her triumphant return to the office, unaware that her career in corporate marketing was about to become collateral damage in a much larger fall from grace. Tomorrow, the carefully constructed world they'd built on my silence would crumble. Tomorrow, the whispered name of Turner would echo through the corridors with its true weight. Tomorrow, they would learn the cost of underestimating the quiet wife who had watched and waited for 15 years. Monday morning arrived with the weight of destiny. I'd spent the night in my father's old apartment, a penthouse suite above the financial district that Marcus never knew existed. The space remained exactly as my father had left it, including his private study where he'd taught me everything about running Turner International. I dressed with deliberate care, choosing a black Alexander McQueen suit that my father had helped me select years ago for the day you decide to claim your throne, as he'd put it. The outfit was armor, every detail calculated. Diamond studs in my ears, my mother's, from the day she'd joined the board. The vintage Cartier watch my father wore when signing his first billion-dollar deal, and a single ruby ring bearing the Turner family crest. James arrived precisely at 7 a.m., his timing impeccable as always. The board members have already started. Arriving, he reported as we descended to the private garage. Security confirms Mr. Turner and Ms. Chen are attempting to coordinate their entrance strategies. I smiled at their predictability. And the media? Anonymous tips about major changes at Turner International reached every major financial news outlet last night. They're gathering outside the main entrance. Perfect. Marcus had always loved playing to the media, crafting his image as the brilliant CEO who'd built a global empire. Today, that same media attention would serve a different purpose. We took the private entrance, bypassing the growing crowd of reporters. Through the tinted windows, I caught glimpses of their expectant faces, cameras ready to capture what they thought would be a standard corporate power play. They had no idea they were about to witness the greatest reversal in Turner International's history. The executive floor was already humming with tension when I arrived. Board members clustered in small groups, their usual confident demeanor replaced by uncertain whispers. They'd had all weekend to review the packets I'd sent, to realize the extent of their CEO's deception and their own oversight. Lawrence met me at my private office, his expression carefully composed. Marcus is in the main boardroom with his lawyer. He's demanding the meeting start early. Let him wait, I replied, settling behind my desk. Has Victoria arrived? She's in the lobby. Security is holding her there until you give the word. I checked the time, 8:45 a.m. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for 9:30. Have her escorted to the conference room on the floor below. Make sure she has a clear view of the boardroom screens. Lawrence's lips twitched. You want her to watch? I want her to learn, I corrected. Some lessons are best taught through observation. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of final preparations. Diane coordinated with IT, ensuring all presentation systems were ready. Sarah positioned herself near Victoria, ready to report any reactions. The old guard, employees loyal to my father's memory, moved through their tasks with barely contained anticipation. At 9:15, I received confirmation that all shareholders were connected virtually, their faces appearing on the secondary screens around the boardroom. Marcus had been trying to engage them in conversation, unaware that most had already switched their allegiance after reviewing my evidence. "It's time," Lawrence announced softly. I stood, smoothing my jacket. The weight of my father's watch pressed against my wrist, its steady ticking a reminder of his favorite saying. In business, timing isn't everything. It's the only thing. The walk to the boardroom felt like crossing a threshold. Every step took me further from the role I'd played for 15 years and closer to the position I was born to hold. Through the glass walls, I could see Marcus at the head of the table, his back to the door, gesturing emphatically to his increasingly uncomfortable audience. "And so, despite recent personal matters," he was saying, "I assure you that Turner International remains stronger than ever under my leadership." The doors opened. The room fell silent as I entered, followed by Lawrence and Diane. Marcus turned, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion as he registered my presence. "Elizabeth," he began, his tone condescending, "this is a closed board meeting. Your presence isn't Actually," I cut in, my voice carrying clearly through the room, "my presence is not only appropriate, but required." I moved to the opposite end of the table, facing him directly. After all, shouldn't the owner of Turner International attend its most important shareholder meeting? The color drained from Marcus's face. Around the table, board members straightened in their seats, their attention sharpening. On the screens, shareholders leaned closer to their cameras. "Owner?" Marcus's lawyer sputtered, shuffling through his papers. "There must be some mistake. Mr. Turner is the chief executive and primary—" "Lawrence," I interrupted smoothly, "please distribute the ownership documents." With practiced efficiency, Lawrence began placing folders before each board member. The room filled with the sound of papers being opened, followed by sharp intakes of breath as the truth was revealed in black and white. Marcus grabbed the folder nearest to him, his hands shaking slightly as he read. I watched his expression change as realization dawned, the same look he'd worn when signing his employment contract 15 years ago, never questioning why a junior executive had been given such an opportunity. "This is impossible," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. He was already connecting the dots, remembering all the times his riskier decisions had been mysteriously modified, all the times his more aggressive strategies had been quietly adjusted. "Nothing is impossible," I replied, taking my seat at the head of the table. "Especially not for the daughter of Richard Turner." The boardroom crackled with electric tension as my words hung in the air. Marcus's lawyer was frantically flipping through documents, his forehead beading with sweat as he encountered page after page of irrefutable evidence. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and dawning comprehension. "Richard Turner's daughter," Jonathan Pierce repeated slowly, his usual self-assured demeanor cracking. All this time, I confirmed, my voice steady, "I've been exactly where my father placed me, at the heart of Turner International, watching, learning, and protecting his legacy." I turned to Marcus, who remained frozen in his chair. "Though I must admit, you made the watching part remarkably easy. You never once questioned why your wife took such an interest in your work discussions." Marcus's throat worked as he swallowed. "The private meetings, the late-night strategy sessions, were exactly what they appeared to be," I finished for him. A wife supporting her husband's career. The fact that I was also evaluating every decision, guiding outcomes, and protecting the company from your riskier impulses. Well, that was just an added benefit. On the screens above us, shareholders were sending a flood of messages. The chat log scrolled rapidly as they processed the implications of this revelation. Many were connecting dots they'd never noticed before. The company's consistent success despite some of Marcus's more questionable decisions, the mysterious stability during market downturns, the inexplicable shifts in strategy that always seemed to work out perfectly. "The Milan acquisition," Marcus said suddenly, his face paling further. "You knew about Victoria." "From the first dinner meeting," I confirmed, nodding to Sarah, who had slipped quietly into the room. She distributed a new set of folders, these ones containing detailed reports of every encounter, every misused company fund, every breach of corporate ethics. Marcus's lawyer began to stand, blustering about privacy violations, but Lawrence smoothly interjected. All surveillance was conducted within legal corporate guidelines, specifically those outlined in the executive contract Mr. Turner signed. Page 37, paragraph 4, if you'd care to review it. I watched as Marcus frantically flipped to the referenced page, no doubt remembering the day he'd signed that contract. Too eager for power to read the fine print, his hands trembled slightly as he found the clause, the one my father had insisted on including, knowing someday it would prove vital. "Additionally," I continued, pressing a button on the conference table, "we have a live feed from Conference Room B where your fiancé is currently watching these proceedings." The central screen split, revealing Victoria's shocked face as she realized she was now visible to the entire board. "Ms. Chen, I believe you have some expertise in corporate communications. How would you suggest we handle this situation?" Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her carefully crafted image crumbling in real time. The red blazer she'd chosen to project power now seemed garish against her rapidly paling complexion. "The Milan documents," Marcus tried again, grasping for control. "The deals, the contracts, are all completely legitimate," I assured him. "Every signature authorized, every deal properly executed. The only irregularities involve your personal expenses, the ones you tried to hide in the acquisition costs." I gestured to the documents before us. 15 years of meticulous, record-keeping, Marcus. Did you really think no one was watching? Jonathan Pierce cleared his throat. "The board should have." "The board," I cut in smoothly, "operated exactly as my father intended. You provided oversight of the CEO's activities while the true owner maintained control through other channels." I met his eyes directly. "Though I must say, Jonathan, introducing Marcus to Victoria at your charity gala was an unexpected twist. Were you aware of their intentions, or was that simply an unfortunate coincidence?" Pierce's face reddened as other board members turned to stare at him. His role in the drama was now another piece of the puzzle falling into place. "Now," I continued, turning back to the shareholders on screen, "let's discuss the company's future. Marcus has prepared a presentation about restructuring Turner International. However, I have a different vision to share." Marcus's lawyer finally found his voice. "This is outrageous. Mr. Turner's contract clearly states—" "Is void," Lawrence interrupted, "due to multiple breaches of fiduciary duty and ethics violations, all documented in the reports before you. Additionally," he added with a slight smile, "Mr. Turner's authority as CEO has always been contingent on the owner's approval, as clearly stated in the company bylaws." I stood, commanding the room's attention. Turner International was built on my father's principles: integrity, innovation, and unwavering dedication to excellence. Over the past 15 years, I've honored those principles from the shadows. Today, that changes. The room held its breath as I moved to the presentation screen. Behind me, I could hear Marcus's ragged breathing, could practically feel the weight of his collapsing world pressing down on him. On the split screen, Victoria sat motionless, her ambitious dreams of becoming the next Mrs. Turner crumbling before her eyes. "Shall we begin?" I asked, my finger hovering over the presentation. Remote. The question was rhetorical. Everyone in the room knew that the real presentation had already begun the moment I walked through the door. Everything that followed would simply be the execution of a plan 15 years in the making. The presentation, screen flickered to life, but instead of Marcus's planned restructuring proposals, a different set of slides appeared. The Turner International logo dominated the first image, but with a subtle difference. The founding date now correctly listed. My father's original establishment of the company, 15 years earlier than the date Marcus had always claimed. As you can see, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned boardroom. There's been some confusion about our company's history. Let's correct that, shall we? The next slide showed a complex organizational chart, one that had never been made public. At the very top sat Turner Holdings, the parent company I'd inherited from my father. Below it, a web of subsidiaries and shell corporations revealed the true structure of our corporate empire, one that made Marcus's position as CEO of Turner International seem almost quaint in comparison. For those wondering about the financial implications, I continued, noting the shareholders' intense focus on their screens. Turner Holdings controls not just Turner International, but 7 other major corporations across 3 continents. The Milan acquisition, which some of you have expressed concern about, is actually a small piece of a much larger strategy. Marcus's lawyer frantically whispered in his ear, but Marcus seemed beyond hearing. His face had taken on an ashen quality. As he stared at the screen, no doubt calculating just how much power he'd never actually had. Ms. Turner, one of the shareholders spoke up, their voice sharp through the conference system. Are you suggesting that Turner International's reported market value is inaccurate? Not inaccurate, I corrected smoothly. Incomplete. Turner International's success has been genuine, but it's been carefully managed to appear self-contained. In reality, it's part of a much larger ecosystem. I clicked to the next slide, revealing financial projections that made several board members audibly gasp. These are the true numbers, gentlemen. Your investment has been performing significantly, better than you realized. Victoria, still visible on the split screen, had pulled out her phone, no doubt trying to make sense of what this meant for her future. I watched her expression shift as she presumably found the breaking news headlines. The story had already leaked to the financial press, exactly as planned. Now, I continued, moving to stand directly behind Marcus's chair. Let's address the immediate concerns. First, the Milan acquisition will proceed, but under revised terms. Our legal team has already prepared updated contracts that eliminate certain unnecessary expenses. I placed a hand on the back of Marcus's chair, feeling him tense at the touch. Second, the proposed restructuring will not be happening, at least not in the way originally planned. The board approved, Marcus started, finding his voice at last. The board, I cut in smoothly, approved a plan presented by a CEO who they believed held executive authority. That authority, as we've established, was contingent on my approval, which is hereby withdrawn. Lawrence stepped forward, distributing another set of documents. These are the actual restructuring plans, which have been in development for the past year. You'll notice they focus on strengthening our core operations rather than eliminating key personnel. Jonathan Pierce studied the papers intently, his frown deepening. These projections, they're based on market trends that weren't public when... His voice trailed off as understanding dawned. When Marcus began planning his version, I finished for him. Correct. Turner Holdings has access to significantly more market data than Turner International. We've been using that information to guide company strategy for years, though of course we had to be subtle about it. Marcus couldn't know he was implementing my father's long-term vision rather than creating his own. The room fell silent as the full implications sank in. Every major success Marcus had claimed, every brilliant strategy he'd boasted about, had been carefully orchestrated. His meteoric rise in the business world had been a carefully constructed illusion, and now that illusion was shattering. "The shareholders will need time to process this," one of the board members ventured. "They'll have it," I assured him, "along with access to the complete corporate records, which should answer any lingering questions about the company's true position." I paused, allowing a small smile. Though I suspect the market's reaction tomorrow will speak for itself. Victoria's image on the screen suddenly became more animated as she appeared to receive some news on her phone. Her face drained of color as she looked directly into the camera. "Ah," I noted. "I see Ms. Chen has just discovered that her resignation has been accepted, effective immediately, with certain interesting clauses activated in her termination agreement." I turned to Lawrence. "Would you care to explain?" "The standard non-compete clause," Lawrence began, his tone professionally neutral but with a hint of satisfaction, "has been expanded to include all Turner Holdings companies and their subsidiaries. Additionally, given the circumstances of her departure, the ethics violation clauses have been triggered, requiring full repayment of any company resources used for personal matters." Marcus surged to his feet. "You can't—" "Actually," I interrupted, "I can, and I have. But don't worry, Marcus. Your own termination agreement is even more comprehensive. After all," I added, watching his face contort as the reality of his situation finally hit home, "you had a much higher position to fall from." The shareholders on screen were now engaged in rapid discussion, their chat log flowing with questions and comments. The board members exchanged loaded glances, already beginning to realign themselves with the true power in the room. And through it all, I maintained my position at the head of the table, exactly where my father had always intended me to be. Outside the boardroom windows, the morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the cityscape. News helicopters circled the building, their distant chopping sound a reminder of the media frenzy building below. My phone buzzed continuously with notifications as the story spread through financial circles like wildfire. "Those quarterly review meetings you found so tedious? The ones you usually sent Victoria to handle?" I smiled as understanding dawned on his face. She was actually reporting directly to my team, though she didn't realize it. Every presentation, every proposal was being evaluated at a much higher level. Victoria's image on the screen showed her processing this information, no doubt remembering all the meetings she'd thought she was controlling, all the decisions she'd believed were hers to influence. Her carefully constructed plan to rise through the company ranks had been built on completely false assumptions. "The Asian markets will be opening soon," Lawrence noted, checking his watch. "Shall we proceed with the next phase?" I nodded, and he distributed another set of documents to the board members. These ones contained the full strategy for the next 24 hours, hour-by-hour plans for managing the market reaction, handling press inquiries, and restructuring the company's public image. "You'll notice," I said to the stunned board, "members, that your roles in this transition have been carefully considered. Those of you who have demonstrated genuine commitment to the company's success will find your positions secured and potentially enhanced." My gaze swept the room. Others may want to consider their options carefully. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were all suddenly reviewing their past decisions, wondering which category they fell into, realizing that every vote, every meeting, every casual conversation had been noted and evaluated. "Ms. Turner," one of the shareholders spoke up, their voice cautious through the conference system, "what are your immediate plans for company leadership?" "An excellent question," I replied, moving to stand by the window. The media helicopters had multiplied, their cameras no doubt capturing this very moment. Turner International will be undergoing a significant transformation, returning to its roots as a family-owned enterprise while maintaining its position as a global market leader. Marcus's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. everything. He'd thought he'd built, every achievement he'd claimed, was being revealed as part of a much larger design, one in which he'd been merely a temporary player, a placeholder keeping the seat warm for its rightful occupant. For those concerned about stability, I continued, rest assured that this transition has been planned for years. Every detail, every contingency has been accounted for. I turned back to the room, noting how the morning light cast my shadow, long across the boardroom floor. After all, I am my father's daughter, and if there's one thing Richard Turner taught me, it's the importance of playing the long game. The next hour unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance. As news of the revelation spread through the building, employees gathered in clusters, their whispered conversations a backdrop to the corporate drama playing out in the boardroom. Those who had been loyal to my father's memory walked with newfound confidence, while others who had aligned themselves with Marcus suddenly found reasons to update their resumes. Sarah appeared at the doorway, tablet in hand. The first wave of international reactions is coming in. The Tokyo Stock Exchange has halted trading in all Turner-affiliated companies. European markets are scrambling to adjust their valuations. The Financial Times is running a special evening edition. I accepted the tablet, scanning the incoming data with practiced ease. Each market reaction, each analyst's prediction, followed the patterns we'd anticipated. The financial world was realizing that Turner International was merely the visible tip of a much larger corporate iceberg. "Your father's old partners are calling," Diane added, her eyes gleaming. "Especially Charles Winston from Winston Global." Marcus's head snapped up at that name. Charles Winston had been his primary competitor for years, the one CEO he'd never managed to outmaneuver. Now, the reason for those failures was becoming clear. "Charles has always known the truth," I explained, enjoying the way Marcus's face contorted at this revelation. "He and my father were planning the merger of our Asian operations when Dad fell ill. We've been quietly proceeding with those plans ever since." "The Singapore deal," Marcus whispered, realization dawning. "Last year's failed acquisition attempt." "Wasn't a failure at all," I confirmed. "It was a carefully orchestrated step in a much larger plan. While you were focusing on the visible competition, the real work was happening behind the scenes." I turned to the board members. "The Singapore facilities are already being integrated into our Asian network. The paperwork will be finalized this afternoon." Victoria, still watching from the conference room below, visibly flinched. She'd been the one to declare the Singapore deal dead, proudly presenting her analysis of why it had failed. Her reputation as a strategic advisor had been built on such assessments, all of which, she was now learning, had been precisely what we wanted her to believe. "Your entire marketing strategy," I continued, addressing her directly through the screen, "has been based on incomplete data. Those market trends you've been tracking, they represent barely 30% of our actual global operations." The color drained from Victoria's face as she frantically began typing on her phone, no doubt trying to access the reports she'd based her career on. But her access had already been revoked, her carefully curated digital empire reduced to empty folders and denied permissions. Lawrence stepped forward with another set of documents. "These are the preliminary terms for the Winston Global merger. As you'll see, the groundwork has been laid over the past decade through a series of seemingly unrelated joint ventures and minor acquisitions." The board members pored over the papers, their expressions a mix of awe and dismay as they realized the true scope of what had been happening under their supposed oversight. Every failed deal they'd criticized, every missed opportunity they'd lamented, had actually been part of a master strategy they'd never glimpsed. "The Asian markets open in 4 hours," I noted, checking my father's watch. "By then, the full extent of Turner Holdings' global presence will be public knowledge. I suggest those of you with significant market positions contact your financial advisors promptly." Jonathan Pierce cleared his throat. "The regulatory implications. have been fully addressed, I cut in smoothly. The SEC has already received comprehensive documentation of all holdings and transactions. Unlike some people, I glanced pointedly at Marcus, we believe in absolute transparency with regulatory authorities. Marcus's lawyer, who had been frantically making calls in the corner, suddenly looked up with fresh alarm. The SEC filing. It includes the Milan expense reports? Every detail, I confirmed. Every hotel booking, every private dinner, every questionable allocation of company resources. The Ethics Committee will have quite a lot to discuss at their next meeting. I paused, letting that sink in. Though I suspect the discussion will be rather one-sided, given that most of the participants in those expenses will no longer be employed here. Victoria's screen suddenly went black. She had finally realized the full implications of her position and fled the conference room. Security would ensure she left the building without accessing any sensitive areas. Her personal belongings would be packed and shipped to her after a thorough review for any company property. The press conference is scheduled for 2 o'clock, Diane announced, entering with a fresh stack of reports. All major financial networks have confirmed their attendance. The Wall Street Journal is requesting an exclusive interview for their weekend edition. I nodded, already anticipating how the narrative would unfold. The story of a corporate heir who had watched silently as her husband built his career on her family's legacy, only to reveal her true identity at the perfect moment. It was the kind of drama the financial press lived for. One last thing, I added, turning back to the stunned room. Those of you wondering about your own positions in the company's future, consider this meeting your first evaluation. Your reactions, your choices in the coming hours, will determine whether you have a place in Turner Holdings' next chapter. The board members straightened in their seats, suddenly very conscious of their every expression, every word. They were realizing that while they'd been watching Marcus, evaluating his performance as CEO, someone else had been watching them, measuring their true worth to the company's future. The executive floor had transformed into a command center of calculated chaos. Phones rang incessantly, emails flooded in from every time zone, and the constant hum of urgent conversations filled the air. Through it all, I maintained my position at the head of the boardroom table, watching as the carefully laid pieces of my plan clicked into place. Goldman Sachs is on line 3, Diane announced, appearing with yet another stack of urgent messages. Their analysts are recalculating their entire market projections based on the Turner Holdings revelation. Morgan Stanley and J.P. Morgan have requested emergency meetings. I smiled, remembering all the times these same institutions had dismissed my input during social events, treating me as merely the CEO's decorative wife. Now they were scrambling to understand how they'd missed the presence of one of the largest privately held conglomerates in the global market. Marcus sat slumped in his chair, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. His lawyer had abandoned any pretense of control, now frantically reading through employment contracts and non-compete clauses. Every few minutes, another notification would ping on their phones, another business contact distancing themselves, another opportunity evaporating. The Milan team is requesting clarification on their reporting structure, Lawrence noted, reviewing updates on his tablet. Apparently, several executives there have suddenly remembered meetings with a consulting team that visited last quarter. Ah, yes, I replied, enjoying Marcus's confused expression. That would be when I personally reviewed their operations, though they knew me only as Mrs. Turner, making a social visit with her husband's overseas partners. I turned to the board members. It's amazing how much people reveal when they think you're just a corporate wife taking an interest in your husband's work. Jonathan Pierce shifted uncomfortably. Those private dinners at your house, the strategy discussions, were quite illuminating, I confirmed, especially when you all felt comfortable speaking freely in front of the quiet hostess who kept your wine glasses filled. I met his gaze directly. Tell me, Jonathan, how is your daughter enjoying her position at Victoria's former marketing firm? The one that mysteriously won several major contracts after you introduced Marcus to Ms. Chen? Pierce's face drained of color as he realized the extent of my knowledge. Every casual conversation, every seemingly innocent business dinner had been an opportunity for intelligence gathering. While they had underestimated me, I had been building a comprehensive map of their connections, their motivations, their vulnerabilities. The PR team has prepared initial statements for all major markets, Sarah reported, entering with a fresh set of documents. Asia-Pacific releases are ready for review. European statements will follow within the hour. I nodded, accepting the yaw. Files? Each press release had been crafted months in advance, waiting for this moment. The narratives were carefully calibrated for different cultural contexts. The Asian markets would respond to the story of a dutiful daughter honoring her father's legacy, while European outlets would focus on the strategic brilliance of the long-term deception. Your father's old office has been prepared, Diane added quietly. Everything is exactly as he left it. Marcus's head snapped up. That office has been sealed since you claimed it was being renovated, I finished for him. In reality, it's been maintained as the command center for Turner Holdings' global operations. Every major decision this company has made has originated from that room. I stood, smoothing my skirt. Would you like to see it? After all, you've spent 15 years wondering what was behind those locked doors. The walk to my father's office felt like a procession. Board members and executives lined the hallway, watching as I led the stunned group toward the supposedly abandoned corner of the executive floor. Marcus trailed behind, his steps heavy with the weight of realization. The doors opened silently, revealing a space that was both a preserved memorial and a modern command center. My father's mahogany desk dominated one end, while the opposite wall displayed a bank of screens showing real-time data from markets worldwide. Family photos lined the shelves. Not the formal portraits Marcus knew, but intimate moments. My father teaching me to read financial statements. My first board meeting attendance at age 12, the day he officially named me his successor. Everything makes sense now, one of the board members whispered, taking in the sophisticated setup. The mysterious strategy shifts, the perfectly timed market moves. All coordinated from here, I confirmed, moving to stand behind my father's desk, my desk now. While Marcus played CEO in the public office, the real decisions were being made in this room. I activated the main screen, revealing a comprehensive organizational chart. Welcome to the heart of Turner Holdings, gentlemen. I trust you now. Understand why today's revelations were inevitable. Marcus stared at a photo on the desk, one taken at our wedding. In it, my father stood beside us, his hand on my shoulder, a knowing smile on his face. 15 years later, that smile carried a very different meaning. The Tokyo market opens in 30 minutes, Lawrence announced, checking his watch. Shall we begin the next phase? I settled into my father's chair, feeling the weight of generations of Turner business acumen settling around me. Yes, I replied. I believe it's time to show the world exactly what Turner Holdings is capable of. The Tokyo markets had barely opened when my phone began lighting up with messages from a different sector of my life, the social circles that had defined my existence as Marcus's wife, the country club wives, the charity board members, the social committees I'd served on while quietly gathering intelligence about their husbands' business dealings. Mrs. Rothschild is quite insistent about speaking with you, Diane reported, a hint of amusement in her voice. She mentioned something about reconsidering the chairmanship of the hospital board. I allowed myself a small smile, remembering how Barbara Rothschild had subtly shouldered me aside during last month's committee elections, claiming the hospital board needed someone with real business experience. The irony was delicious. Tell her I'll consider it during next quarter's review of our medical investment portfolio, I replied, watching understanding dawn on the board members' faces. The hospital's major funding, they were realizing, came from one of Turner Holdings' subsidiary foundations. Marcus's phone buzzed continuously, country club members suddenly canceling their golf games, business associates developing scheduling, conflicts, social acquaintances sending awkward messages of support that carefully avoided taking sides. His social capital was evaporating as quickly as his professional authority. "The Edison Group's CEO is on hold," Sarah announced. "Apparently, they're very eager to discuss that joint venture Marcus rejected last month. Put them through to conference room C," I instructed. "Have them speak with our actual development team." I turned to Marcus. "You know, the one that's been running parallel negotiations while you played at being in charge." His face reddened as he remembered his bombastic rejection of the Edison proposal, how he'd lectured their board about understanding true market value. Now, he was realizing that his declaration of corporate independence had been nothing more than a performance, watched and managed by the true power behind his throne. "Victoria's assistant reports she's trying to access her social media accounts from home," Lawrence noted, checking his tablet. "All company-related platforms have been secured." I nodded, unsurprised. Victoria had spent years building her image as a corporate influencer, posting about leadership and women in business. Her carefully curated online presence had been part of what attracted Marcus, the illusion of a power couple in the making. "Ensure her termination agreement is clear about confidentiality requirements," I instructed. "We wouldn't want her attempting to monetize this experience through a tell-all post." The board members shifted uncomfortably, no doubt remembering their own social media activities. How many of them had shared Marcus's posts, endorsed his business insights, hitched their professional reputations to his supposed expertise. "The Westbrook Foundation is requesting confirmation about next month's charity gala," Diane added. "Given the circumstances—" "The gala will proceed as planned," I interrupted smoothly. "Though I believe the guest list may need some revision." I met Jonathan Pierce's eyes, particularly regarding the seating arrangements at the primary donor table. Pierce swallowed hard. The Westbrook Gala was the social event of the season, where business deals were made and corporate alliances formed. The seating chart was a carefully orchestrated display of power and influence, one that would now reflect the true hierarchy of Turner Holdings. "Charles Winston's wife sends her regards," Sarah mentioned, a slight smile playing at her lips. "She particularly enjoyed last week's garden party." Marcus's head snapped up. "Garden party? You said you were at a spa retreat?" "I was having tea with Margaret Winston and several other corporate wives," I corrected, "discussing the upcoming merger while our husbands thought we were sharing beauty tips." I paused, letting that sink in. "Though, in your case, the husband in question was rather preoccupied with his marketing director." The reminder of his indiscretion hung heavy in the air. Several board members suddenly found their phones fascinating, avoiding Marcus's gaze. They were all calculating the social cost of their association with him, realizing that their wives would soon be navigating a very different corporate landscape. "The Four Seasons has called about your standing reservation," Diane noted, directing this to Marcus. "Apparently there's some confusion about the corporate account." "Cancel it," I instructed, "along with any other accounts he's been using for personal entertainment." I met Marcus's eyes. "I believe Ms. Chen will need to update her expense reports as well." The implications were clear. Every dinner, every weekend getaway, every supposedly discreet rendezvous had been monitored and documented. The paper trail of their affair would become part of the corporate record, a cautionary tale for future executives who might consider mixing business with pleasure. "The social secretary would like to know about this evening's symphony gala," Sarah added. "You're scheduled to present the Turner Foundation's annual donation." "Which I'll do," I confirmed, "as the foundation's actual director, not as the CEO's supportive wife." I turned to the board members. "I trust this clarifies any confusion about the foundation's funding decisions over the past decade." They nodded slowly, understanding dawning. The charitable giving they'd attributed to Marcus's corporate generosity had been another chess piece in my larger game. Every donation, every sponsorship had been carefully calculated to build the relationships I would need when this day arrived. "Your father's club has already transferred your membership to the primary position," Lawrence reported. "The president sends his congratulations and mentions something about a long-standing arrangement." I smiled, remembering my father's words years ago. "The old guard always knew this day would come," I explained to the room. "They've just been waiting to see how it would play out." The afternoon brought the first real attempts at resistance. Marcus's allies, those who had built their own positions on his supposed authority, began emerging from their initial shock to mount what they believed would be a counteroffensive. Their efforts would have been admirable if they weren't so painfully predictable. "Gerald Matthews from Legal is requesting an emergency meeting with the board," Sarah announced, entering with a fresh stack of urgent messages. "He's citing corporate bylaws regarding leadership transitions." I exchanged a knowing look with Lawrence. Gerald had been one of Marcus's first hires, a lawyer who had helped structure numerous deals to maximize Marcus's apparent control. "Show him in," I instructed. "Let's see what creative interpretation he's discovered." Gerald burst into the room, clutching a leather portfolio stuffed with documents. His usual polished appearance was slightly disheveled, his tie askew from what had probably been hours of frantic legal research. "This transition is procedurally irregular," he declared, spreading papers across the table. "According to Section 7, Paragraph 4 of the Corporate Charter." "The 1995 Charter or the actual 1980 founding documents," I interrupted smoothly, "because I believe you're working from an incomplete set of bylaws, Gerald." I nodded to Lawrence, who produced a significantly older and thicker document. "The original Turner Holdings Charter," Lawrence explained, "which supersedes any subsequent Turner International documentation. As you'll note, the succession protocols are quite clear." Gerald's face paled as he scanned the yellowing pages. Every argument he'd prepared, every legal loophole he'd thought to exploit, was systematically dismantled by the founding documents he'd never known existed. "But the board approvals," he tried again, "were obtained 15 years ago. I finished for him. When my father restructured the company specifically to accommodate this eventual transition." I slid another document across the table. "Your own employment contract, in fact, includes a clause acknowledging the authority of Turner Holdings' leadership structure. Page 23, I believe." Marcus watched this exchange with growing desperation. Gerald had been his ace in the hole, the legal mind he'd relied on to find ways around corporate obstacles. Now he was watching his last hope of resistance crumble under the weight of decades of careful planning. "The Tokyo market has closed," Diane reported, entering with a tablet displaying financial data. "Turner Holdings' revelation has triggered a complete revaluation of all Asian assets. The numbers are significant." I studied the figures with satisfaction. The market had responded exactly as predicted, recognizing the true value of what had previously appeared to be unrelated: companies and investments. "Sir Richard Bennett is on the line from London," Sarah added. "He says it's about the European merger discussions." Marcus's head snapped up. "What European merger?" "The one you've been unknowingly preparing for over the past 3 years," I explained. "All those subsidiary acquisitions you pushed through thinking they were your idea, they were positioning us for this exact moment." The board members exchanged glances, suddenly reviewing every major decision they'd approved under Marcus's leadership. How many other strategic moves had been subtly guided by unseen hands? "Victoria's lawyer has sent a letter," Lawrence noted, scanning his tablet. "She's claiming wrongful termination and threatening to go public with insider information about company operations." I smiled, remembering all the confidentiality agreements Victoria had signed. each one carefully worded to protect Turner Holdings' interests. Send her the complete documentation of her contract violations. Include the surveillance photos from the Milan trip. Remind her that any public statements will trigger the non-disclosure penalties. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, no doubt remembering other trips, other meetings that might have been documented. You can't just erase people's careers, he protested weakly. No, I agreed. People do that themselves when they choose to violate their fiduciary duties. I turned to the board members. Speaking of which, I believe several of you have some interesting stock transactions to explain to the SEC. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Every trade, every suspicious timing of purchases or sales around major company announcements had been noted and documented. The oversight they thought they'd escaped had been constant and comprehensive. Charles Winston is hosting a dinner tonight to discuss the Asian market response, Diane mentioned. He specifically requested your attendance as Turner Holdings, CEO. The emphasis on my new title wasn't lost on anyone. Marcus had spent years competing with Charles, never understanding why he couldn't gain the upper hand. Now the truth was clear. He had never been playing at the same level. Gerald, I addressed the still stunned lawyer. I believe you have some documentation to review. Lawrence will provide you with the complete set of corporate records. I expect your full report on any potentially problematic transactions by tomorrow morning. Gerald nodded numbly, recognizing the implicit message. His choice was clear: adapt to the new reality or join Marcus in professional exile. Around the table, other executives were making similar calculations, their loyalties shifting as rapidly as the market valuations. One last thing, I added, standing to assert my position. For those wondering about their future with Turner Holdings, remember this moment. Your reactions today, your choices in handling this transition, will determine whether you have a place in what comes next. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through my father's office windows as I prepared for my first public appearance as Turner Holdings' CEO. The transformation from Marcus's quiet wife to corporate leader wasn't just internal. It required a careful orchestration of every detail. The press conference setup is complete, Diane announced, entering with a garment bag. Your father's personal stylist sent this over. She says it's exactly what he would have chosen for such an occasion. Inside was a perfectly tailored Alexander McQueen suit in deep charcoal, with subtle pinstripes that echoed the Turner International logo. The cut was impeccable, designed to command attention rather than blend into the background as my previous wardrobe had been chosen to do. Margaret Winston called, Sarah added, checking her tablet. She's arranged for the other wives to be watching the broadcast from the country club. Apparently, they've reserved the main dining room. I smiled, imagining the scene. All those women who had patronized me over the years, who had dismissed my quiet observations during their gossip sessions, about to witness exactly who they'd been underestimating. Victoria has been trying to contact several financial journalists, Lawrence reported. However, they seem more interested in speaking with the actual Turner Holdings CEO. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Victoria had spent years building her network of media contacts, positioning herself as an insider with access to corporate power. Now those same journalists were ignoring her calls in favor of the real story. Marcus sat in a corner of the office, watching as my team prepared for the press conference. His expression shifted between disbelief and growing comprehension as each detail revealed another layer of my long-term planning. The outfit you wore to the Milan deal signing, he said. Suddenly. It wasn't new, was it? It was my mother's, I confirmed, remembering the day she had worn it to her own first board meeting. I had it altered years ago, waiting for the right moment. Every piece I've worn to major company events has carried its own history, its own connection to the Turner legacy. The board members, who had been reviewing market data, looked up with renewed interest. They were beginning to understand that every detail of my appearance, every seemingly casual choice, had been part of a carefully crafted narrative. Your father's watch, Jonathan Pierce noted, gesturing to my wrist. You've been wearing it all year. Since the exact day I gained majority control of the final shares needed for this transition, I confirmed. Though everyone assumed it was simply a sentimental choice, a widow wearing her late husband's timepiece. The weight of the watch felt different now that its true significance was known. Every tick had been counting down to this moment, every glance at its face a reminder of the approaching revelation. The hair, the makeup, the subtle changes in your wardrobe, Marcus continued, his voice holding a new note of understanding. You've been gradually transforming yourself, haven't you? Getting everyone used to seeing you differently without realizing it. I moved to the full-length mirror that had been installed in my father's office decades ago, specifically for moments like this. The woman reflected there was a perfect blend of Turner authority and feminine power, exactly the image my father had helped me craft over years of preparation. The social pages called it a style evolution, I noted, adjusting my jacket. They attributed it to Victoria's influence, assuming I was trying to keep up with my husband's glamorous new companion. None of them noticed that each change aligned perfectly with major company milestones. Sarah approached with a jewelry box I recognized from my mother's collection. Inside was the Turner family signet ring, resized years ago to fit my hand. The board photos have been updated throughout the building, she reported. Every portrait of Marcus has been replaced with the historical progression of Turner leadership, ending with you. Marcus stood abruptly, moving to the window. Below, media vans were arriving, setting up for the press conference that would formally announce the change in leadership. His own image was already being erased, his legacy reduced to a footnote in the Turner family history. The European markets have closed, Lawrence announced, reviewing the final trading data. The complete restructuring of Turner Holdings' public profile has triggered a massive revaluation of all associated companies. The financial press is calling it the Turner Revelation. I slipped on the signet ring, watching how it caught the light. The family crest, which had seemed like a simple decorative element to outsiders, was actually a subtle reminder of the power structure that had always existed behind the scenes. Your father's original office in London has been reopened, Diane added. The executive team there is standing by for your first international video conference as CEO. The pieces were falling into place with practiced precision. Each location, each team member, each detail had been prepared for this transition. The quiet wife who had watched from the shadows was stepping into the light, revealing herself as the architect of a global business empire. It's time, Lawrence announced, checking his watch. The media is ready. I took one final look in the mirror, seeing not just my reflection but the culmination of years of careful planning. The transformation was complete, from the subtle power behind the throne to the Queen taking her rightful place in full view of the world. The press conference room buzzed with anticipation. Journalists from every major financial publication filled the seats, their cameras ready, tablets poised to document what was already being called the business story of the decade. The room itself had been subtly transformed. The backdrop now displayed the complete Turner Holdings logo rather than just the Turner International branch that Marcus had always showcased. Financial Times is leading with the headline, "The Hidden Queen of Wall Street," Sarah whispered, showing me her tablet. Bloomberg has already updated their billionaires list. You're now officially ranked higher than Marcus ever was. Marcus, seated in the front row between two security officers, flinched visibly at this news. His own net worth had been largely illusory, built on stock options that were now worthless and positions that had never been truly his to claim. The divorce papers have been prepared, Lawrence murmured, placing a slim folder on the podium, along with documentation of all company assets that were mistakenly attributed to Marcus's personal wealth. I smiled, remembering all the times Marcus had boasted about his financial acumen, how he'd built his fortune through shrewd business decisions. Now everyone would know that his supposed personal investments had been carefully managed Turner. Holdings operations all along. Victoria has arrived, Diane reported via earpiece. She's in the media overflow room, apparently trying to convince reporters to hear her side of the story. No one seems interested. The irony was perfect. Victoria, who had planned to leverage her relationship with Marcus into greater social and professional prominence, was discovering that her carefully cultivated influence had evaporated the moment the true power structure was revealed. Charles Winston is on his way, Sarah added. He's bringing the final merger documents, the ones Marcus thought were still in preliminary negotiations. I nodded, adjusting my father's watch. The merger that Marcus had spent months trying to prevent would now be announced as part of Turner Holdings' global expansion, a deal that had been in place since before he'd even known Victoria existed. Ladies and gentlemen, the PR director began, please welcome Elizabeth Turner, CEO of Turner Holdings and majority owner of the Turner International Group. The room erupted in camera flashes as I approached the podium. Every step was measured, every movement choreographed to project the authority I'd always possessed, but never publicly displayed. The watching journalists leaned forward, sensing that the prepared statement would be just the beginning of a much bigger story. 15 years ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the room. My father entrusted me with not just a company, but a legacy. He taught me that true power lies not in its display, but in understanding when to reveal it. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was finally understanding all those long conversations about business strategy that I'd encouraged during our marriage, realizing that every suggestion I'd made had been carefully calculated to guide the company according to my larger plan. Turner Holdings has always operated as my father envisioned, I continued, with patience, precision, and a clear vision for the future. Today, we're not announcing a change in leadership. We're simply making public what has always been true. The screens behind me filled with data, charts showing Turner Holdings' true market position, diagrams of its global network of companies, evidence of its long-term influence in international markets. The journalists' fingers flew across their keyboards, trying to capture the scope of what was being revealed. For those wondering about recent events, I added, my gaze sweeping over Victoria in the overflow room. Let me be clear. Every decision, every merger, every strategic move has been part of a carefully orchestrated plan. Some people's roles in that plan were more temporary than they realized. The implications weren't lost on anyone. Board members straightened in their seats. Executives adjusted their ties nervously, and somewhere in the overflow room, Victoria's dreams of corporate ascendancy crumbled to dust. As for the future, I continued, nodding to Lawrence, who began distributing comprehensive information packets. Turner Holdings is embarking on a new era of transparent leadership. The strength we've built in the shadows will now serve us in the light. The packets contained details of upcoming mergers, strategic partnerships, and global initiatives, plans that had been years in the making, waiting for this moment of revelation. Marcus stared at the documents, recognition dawning in his eyes as he saw how many of his independent decisions had been subtly guided toward this outcome. Questions, I invited, watching as dozens of hands shot up. The first journalist stood, notebook ready. Ms. Turner, when did you decide to reveal your true position? The decision was made 15 years ago, I replied, enjoying Marcus's sharp intake of breath. Everything since then has been preparation for this moment, including my marriage to the man who thought he was building his own empire. The room erupted in furious note-taking and whispered conversations. Through it all, I maintained the calm demeanor of someone who had always known exactly how this story would end, because in truth, I had. Every step, every decision, every carefully orchestrated moment had led to this, the day when the quiet wife in the background stepped forward to claim her throne. The press conference's aftermath brought a different kind of chaos. While the media dissected every detail of the Turner Holdings revelation, Marcus's world continued to crumble in increasingly visible ways. I watched his deterioration from my father's office, each update confirming that the man who had once seemed so powerful was nothing without the foundation I had provided. His private accounts have been frozen, Lawrence reported, reviewing the latest financial reports. The audit team found significant commingling of personal and corporate funds. Every major purchase he's made in the past decade is now under review. Through the glass walls, I could see Marcus pacing in the conference room where security had escorted him. His designer suit, once a symbol of his supposed success, now looked rumpled and ill-fitting, as if his very presence was shrinking in real time. "The Range Rover has been repossessed," Sarah added, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "Along with the boat he bought last summer. Apparently both were purchased using diverted corporate funds from the Milan expense account." I remembered how proud he'd been of that boat, hosting lavish parties where he'd boasted about his business acumen. Now his guests would learn that even his toys had been bought with money that was never truly his. "Victoria's trying a different approach," Diane noted, checking her messages. "She's reached out to several literary agents, pitching a tell-all book about corporate power couples." "Forward those messages to legal," I instructed. "Remind her that her non-disclosure agreement covers all forms of media, including books. And make sure she understands that any advance she receives will be subject to immediate clawback under the ethics violation clauses." The reminder wouldn't be necessary. No publisher would touch a story that could trigger litigation from Turner Holdings. Victoria's dreams of profiting from her affair were as hollow as her ambitions of becoming the next Mrs. Turner. "Sir Richard Bennett called again," Lawrence mentioned. "The London office is eager to begin the European restructuring now that Marcus's opposition has been neutralized." Through the glass, I watched Marcus react to another call going straight to voicemail. His business contacts were disappearing as quickly as his assets, each one distancing themselves from the man who had been exposed as a mere figurehead. "His membership at the Metropolitan Club has been revoked," Sarah reported. "Apparently, it was tied to his position as CEO. The same goes for his seats on various charitable boards." Marcus had always derived such satisfaction from those positions, treating them as proof of his social ascendancy. Now he was learning that every privilege he'd enjoyed had been granted not because of who he was, but because of who he had married. "The real estate agent called about the Hamptons house," Diane added. "She's confused about the ownership structure." "There is no confusion," I replied. "The property has always been held by Turner Holdings, like everything else Marcus thought was his." I paused, remembering all the weekends he'd spent there with Victoria, thinking they were being discreet. "Have it listed immediately. I think a complete renovation would be appropriate." Marcus's phone buzzed again, probably another creditor. Discovering that his personal guarantees were worthless without the corporate backing they'd always assumed he controlled. His hands shook as he rejected the call, his carefully manicured image of success cracking under the weight of reality. "The security team found something interesting in his private office," Lawrence mentioned, producing a folder. "Draft papers for a post-nuptial agreement. Apparently, he was planning to pressure you into signing away any claim to his company assets before announcing his relationship with Victoria." I accepted the folder, scanning the documents with mild amusement. The agreement had been prepared by the same third-rate law firm, now scrambling to salvage something from the wreckage of Marcus's career. Every clause was predicated on his ownership of assets that had never truly been his. "His mother's called 3 times, Sarah noted. "She's seen the news coverage and wants to know if her foundation funding is secure." Another piece of Marcus's facade crumbled. The charitable foundation bearing his mother's name had been established by Turner Holdings long before he became CEO. She was just now learning that her son's supposed generosity had been yet another illusion. Through the glass, I watched as Marcus loosened his tie, his movements becoming more erratic. The man who had once commanded rooms with his confident presence was visibly unraveling. Each piece of news, each closed door, each unanswered call stripped away another layer of his carefully constructed identity. "The Jensen Group is asking about their joint venture proposal," Lawrence mentioned. "The one Marcus rejected last month, as beneath Turner International's standards." "Set up a meeting," I instructed. "But make it clear they'll be dealing with Turner Holdings directly now. No intermediaries, no figureheads." Marcus's head snapped up at the mention of Jensen, no doubt remembering how he'd lectured their board about understanding true corporate value. Now they would learn that his dismissal of their proposal had been as meaningless as his claims of authority. "One last thing," Diane added, entering with a final update. "The executive residence in Manhattan, the one Marcus used for his private meetings." "Have it cleaned out," I interrupted. "Everything boxed and cataloged. Personal items can be delivered to whatever address he provides once the divorce is finalized." I paused, watching Marcus sink into a chair, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Though I suspect his new accommodations will be significantly more modest. As evening settled over the city, casting long shadows across the executive floor, the time came for the conversations I'd been anticipating for 15 years. The media circus had temporarily subsided, the immediate business concerns had been addressed, and now only the personal reckonings remained. "Marcus is asking to speak with you privately," Lawrence announced, his tone carrying a note of caution. "Security has cleared him, but—" "Let him in," I replied, settling behind my father's desk, my desk now. "It's time we had an honest conversation." Marcus entered slowly, the confident stride of the morning replaced by uncertain steps. His eyes darted around the office, taking in details he'd never noticed before. The hidden monitors displaying global market data, the secure communication systems, the photographs documenting my lifelong preparation for this role. "All this time," he began, his voice hoarse. "Every decision I thought I made was carefully orchestrated," I finished for him. "Those late-night strategy sessions where you'd bounce ideas off your supportive wife? I was actually guiding you toward decisions that had already been made at a much higher level." He sank into the chair across from me, the same chair where he'd sat 15 years ago signing his CEO contract with such enthusiasm. "The Milan deal was never about the acquisition itself," I confirmed. "It was about positioning Turner Holdings for the European merger, the one you thought you were cleverly preventing." I opened a drawer, withdrawing a file. "Your trips with Victoria were just a convenient way to monitor the Milan operations without raising suspicion." His face contorted as the implications sank in. "You knew about Victoria from the beginning." "I knew about Victoria before you did," I corrected, enjoying his startled expression. "When she applied for the marketing director position, her background check revealed some interesting connections to our competitors. I had her hired specifically because I knew she would be susceptible to certain opportunities." "You set us up?" "I created an environment where your worst instincts could flourish," I clarified. "The late meetings, the business trips, the opportunities for private dinners, all carefully arranged to see what choices you would make." The weight of this revelation seemed to physically press him back in his chair. "The anniversary dinner. You knew what we were planning." "Of course." I smiled, remembering his practiced speech, Victoria's rehearsed timing. "I chose the restaurant, after all. Made sure the right people were there to witness your moment of supposed triumph." Sarah entered with a tablet, displaying live feeds from various news channels. Each one showed clips from the press conference, analyzing the implications of Turner Holdings' revelation. Marcus watched himself on the screens, seeing for the first time how small he appeared in the larger story. "Your father," he said suddenly, "at our wedding, that look he gave you during the ceremony." "He was proud," I confirmed. "Not because I was marrying you, but because I was taking the next step in our long-term plan. The quiet wife, the supportive spouse." It was the perfect cover for monitoring company operations from the inside. Victoria's face appeared on one of the news feeds, an archived clip from a corporate event. Marcus flinched visibly. Did she know? Was she part of your plan too? Victoria played exactly the role she chose for herself, I replied. An ambitious woman looking to climb the corporate ladder through any means necessary. The fact that her ambitions served my purposes was just convenient. Lawrence appeared at the door with another update. The SEC has formally requested all documentation regarding the Milan transactions. Have it delivered to them immediately, I instructed. Complete transparency from this point forward. I turned back to Marcus. Your creative accounting methods will make an excellent case study in corporate ethics violations. Marcus's hands clenched on the armrests. Everything I built. You built nothing, I interrupted, my voice sharp for the first time. Every success, every achievement, every moment of triumph was orchestrated by the woman you dismissed as merely decorative. The same woman you mocked to your friends, belittled in meetings, and ultimately planned to discard. The screens showed market analysis of Turner Holdings' true value, numbers that made Marcus's claimed achievements seem almost quaint in comparison. His eyes fixed on the figures, understanding finally dawning about the true scope of what he'd lost. The divorce papers are ready, I noted, sliding a folder across the desk. You'll find the terms quite straightforward. Since everything of value belongs to Turner Holdings, there's really very little to negotiate. And if I fight this? A last flicker of his old arrogance surfaced. Then every detail becomes public record, I replied calmly. Every expense report, every hotel booking, every diverted corporate fund. Your choice, Marcus. Though I should mention that the FBI is particularly interested in some of your more creative financial arrangements. The threat hung in the air between us. Marcus reached for the folder with trembling hands, his world having shrunk from commanding a corporate empire to hoping for a quiet exit. One last thing, I added as he stood to leave. The next time you decide to humiliate someone at an anniversary dinner, make sure you actually know who they are. Night had fallen over the city, the office towers glittering like stars against the dark sky. I stood at my father's window, my window now, watching the last of the media vans pull away from the building. The day's dramatic revelations were already being broadcast around the world, but my work was far from complete. The Asian markets are responding even more strongly than predicted, Lawrence reported, entering with fresh financial data. Turner Holdings' true value has triggered a complete reassessment of several business sectors. The ripple effects are unprecedented. I smiled, remembering my father's words about timing. How are our subsidiary companies performing? Their stock prices are soaring as investors realize their connection to Turner Holdings. The companies Marcus tried to sideline are showing particularly strong growth. A notification popped up. On my phone. Another message from Victoria. After her failed attempts to contact journalists, she was now trying a different approach. My story could help your image, she wrote. Show the human side of corporate leadership. Have legal send her a final warning, I instructed Sarah. Any further attempts at communication will trigger immediate legal action. Her story ended the moment she thought she could use my husband to take my place. The evening news played silently on the office screens, showing clips from the day's events. Each channel told a slightly different version of the story. The hidden corporate heir, the strategic genius who had orchestrated a decade-long plan, the woman who had turned her husband's betrayal into a masterclass in corporate control, the key. Board members are requesting individual meetings, Diane announced. They're eager to demonstrate their flexibility regarding the new leadership structure. Schedule them for next week, I replied. Let them sweat a bit. Their futures with Turner Holdings will depend on more than just their sudden enthusiasm for female leadership. Through the glass walls, I could see the executive floor being transformed. Teams of workers were updating signage, replacing Marcus's carefully chosen corporate artwork with pieces from my father's private collection. The changes were more than cosmetic. They were a statement about the company's true heritage and future direction. Charles Winston called again, Lawrence mentioned. He's particularly impressed with how the revelation was handled. He suggested that the merger timeline could be accelerated. I nodded, moving to my father's old safe, my safe now. Inside, alongside the company's founding documents, lay a letter he had written years ago, meant for this exact moment. I broke the seal, unfolding the paper carefully. My dearest Elizabeth, it began. If you're reading this, then you've finally claimed your rightful place. The path I set you on was never going to be easy, but I knew you had the strength to watch, to learn. Your mother would be proud of the leader you've become. A knock at the door interrupted my reading. It was Jonathan Pierce, looking considerably less confident than he had that morning. Elizabeth, he started, then corrected himself. Ms. Turner, I wanted to explain about the Victoria situation. Your daughter's position at the marketing firm? I interrupted smoothly. The one that mysteriously won several contracts after you introduced Marcus to his future mistress. Don't worry, Jonathan. That's all been documented in the ethics committee's upcoming review. His face paled as he realized the extent of my knowledge. Every deal, every introduction, every seemingly casual business connection had been noted and analyzed. The Turner Foundation Board is being restructured, I continued, enjoying his discomfort. Your position will be reconsidered in light of recent events. After he left, Sarah brought in the latest social media analytics. The story was trending globally, with business schools already requesting case studies on the Turner holdings. Revelation. Marcus's lawyer made an interesting request, Lawrence noted, checking his tablet. He's trying to negotiate keeping some of the public recognition for deals made during his CEO tenure. Remind him that every major decision, every strategic move, is documented as originating from Turner Holdings, I replied. Marcus can keep the memories of his apparent success. The reality belongs to us. A message from the London office appeared. On my screen, urgent updates about the European operations. In the chaos of the day's revelations, our international teams had been quietly implementing long-planned changes, taking advantage of the market's distraction to position Turner Holdings for its next phase of growth. Your father's private journals have been moved to the secure archive, Diane reported, along with all documentation of the original succession plan. I walked to the office bar, not the one Marcus had installed for his client meetings, but my father's original hidden, behind a panel. Inside, a bottle of his favorite scotch waited, preserved for this moment. Have the executive team assemble in the main conference room, I instructed, pouring a single measure into a crystal glass. It's time to outline our next steps. The scotch burned pleasantly as I sipped it, standing where my father had stood countless times before. Outside my window, the city stretched endlessly, its lights representing countless opportunities, connections, and future conquests. One last thing, Sarah added softly. The personal items from your house, the ones you marked for preservation? Have them moved to the penthouse, I replied. The rest can be donated. That life, that persona, is no longer needed. The woman who had played the role of Marcus's wife had served her purpose. Now it was time for Elizabeth Turner, CEO of Turner Holdings, to show the world what real power looked like. The following. Morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect backdrop for the next phase of my emergence. I'd spent the night in my father's penthouse, surrounded by the carefully preserved elements of my true life, rather than the carefully curated facade I'd maintained in the house I'd shared with Marcus. The moving team has finished at the house, Sarah reported as she entered with my morning briefing. Everything has been cataloged and separated according to your instructions. Marcus's personal items have been placed in storage pending his retrieval. I sipped my coffee, not the bland premium roast Marcus had insisted on, but my father's preferred Brazilian blend, which I'd secretly enjoyed every morning in my private office. And the rest? The art collection has been returned to the Turner Holdings vault, she confirmed. The pieces Marcus thought were expensive reproductions? They're being prepared for return to various museums. Apparently, the curators are quite excited to display them publicly again. Another illusion shattered. The paintings Marcus had proudly shown off to visitors, bragging about his investment in fine art, had actually been on rotating loan from my father's connections in the art world. Like everything else in his life, even his cultural sophistication had been carefully staged. Victoria made one final attempt to access the house, Lawrence added, reviewing the security reports. She seemed quite surprised to find the codes changed and her name removed from the approved visitor list. I moved to the penthouse windows, watching the morning sun glint off neighboring towers. Each reflection represented another piece of Marcus's world being systematically dismantled. The country club membership has been officially transferred, Diane noted, along with all the associated social appointments and committee positions. Several board members' wives have already called to express their renewed interest in working with you on various charitable initiatives. The same women who had smiled politely through Marcus's flirtations with Victoria, who had whispered behind their hands about the quiet wife being replaced, were now scrambling to realign themselves with the true source of power. The house. Staff has been reassigned, Sarah continued. Those who were loyal have been offered positions within Turner Holdings' executive support team. The others. She paused diplomatically. The ones who helped Marcus and Victoria arrange their meetings, I finished for her. Make sure their severance packages include appropriate non-disclosure agreements. A notification appeared on my phone, Marcus attempting to access his executive email one last time. The system automatically rejected his credentials, sending him a formal reminder that all company communications were now restricted. His personal assistant called, Diane mentioned. She's quite concerned about her reference for future employment. Tell her that her references will depend entirely on her cooperation with the ethics investigation, I replied, particularly regarding certain creative expenses she helped process. Lawrence entered with a thick folder. The separation of assets is complete. Everything Marcus thought was jointly owned has been documented as Turner Holdings property. His lawyers are struggling to find anything that actually belongs to him personally. I reviewed the documents with satisfaction. Every property, every investment, every significant purchase had been made through carefully structured corporate entities. Marcus's supposed personal wealth had been an elaborate illusion, maintained solely to support his role as the public face of Turner International. The penthouse renovations are ahead of schedule, Sarah reported. The secure office is already functional, and the living spaces are being updated to your preferences rather than the profile we maintained for Marcus's benefit. The profile, a carefully crafted image of a corporate wife with expensive but safe taste, nothing too distinctive or memorable. Now my true aesthetic could emerge, the same sophisticated style that characterized my father's private spaces. Victoria's final belongings have been removed from her office, Diane added, though she seems particularly distressed about losing access to certain files. The ones where she documented her strategic insights? I smiled. Make sure she understands that all company intellectual property remains with Turner Holdings. Her observations about our operations, like everything else, belong to us. A message from the London office appeared on my secure tablet. Updates about the European reorganization. Marcus's supposedly independent international initiatives were being smoothly integrated into Turner Holdings' existing operations. His carefully cultivated business relationships reassigned to our long-term partners. The real estate agent has scheduled the first showings of the house, Sarah noted. Several potential buyers are particularly interested once they learned it was a Turner property. The house, that perfect stage set where I'd played the role of supportive wife for 15 years. Every room had been designed to project exactly the image we'd wanted. Successful executive, power couple, corporate royalty. Now it would be transformed, stripped of the pretense that had defined it. Have the security team do one final sweep, I instructed. Check for any personal items Marcus or Victoria might have hidden away. Anything they left behind becomes company property. Lawrence raised an eyebrow. Including the private safe in his home office? The one he thought you didn't know about? Especially that, I confirmed. Though I suspect he'll find its contents somewhat different from what he remembers. Amazing how documents can change when you don't check them regularly. The morning light strengthened, casting long shadows across the penthouse floor. Each shadow seemed to mark another piece of Marcus's world fading away, while my true domain emerged into the light. A week after the revelation, Marcus requested one final meeting. The media frenzy had settled into serious analysis of Turner Holdings' market impact. Victoria had finally ceased her attempts at contact, and the corporate restructuring was proceeding smoothly. It was time for the last conversation. He's waiting in the main conference room, Lawrence informed me, his tone carefully neutral. Security has cleared him, though his access is strictly limited to that floor. I took a moment at my father's mirror, adjusting my Chanel suit. Not the subtle, understated pieces I'd worn as Marcus's wife, but a commanding ensemble that befitted the CEO of Turner Holdings. The transformation was complete, visible in every detail of my appearance. The divorce papers are ready for his signature, Sarah added, placing a slim folder on my desk. All terms non-negotiable, as per your instructions. The walk to the conference room felt like a victory lap. Employees nodded respectfully as I passed, their loyalty now openly displayed rather than carefully hidden. Through the glass walls, I could see Marcus waiting, his once impeccable appearance notably diminished. The market analysis you requested, Diane murmured, handing me a tablet as I reached the door. Comparing Turner Holdings' actual value to what Marcus claimed in his last public statements. I entered the conference room alone, the click of my heels against the marble floor echoing in the silence. Marcus stood as I approached, a reflexive gesture from years of performing corporate courtesy. Now it seemed almost pathetic. "You've signed the NDA?" I inquired, though I knew he had. Lawrence would have never allowed this meeting otherwise. "Yes," he replied, his voice hoarse. "Though I don't understand why it was necessary. Everyone knows the story now." "Everyone knows what we chose to reveal," I corrected, settling into the chair at the head of the table, his former seat. "The full extent of your creative financial management remains private, pending your cooperation." He sank back into his chair, the threat clear in my words. The ethics investigation had uncovered far more than just his affair with Victoria. Years of minor indiscretions, small financial manipulations, and questionable decisions had been meticulously documented. "The house," he began. "Has been sold," I interrupted smoothly, "along with the vacation properties you thought were personally owned. The proceeds have been returned to the appropriate Turner Holdings accounts." His face tightened. "My investments were all made with company funds through corporate entities," I finished. "The documentation is quite clear. Your personal portfolio, once you remove Turner Holdings assets, is remarkably modest." The tablet before me displayed real-time market data, showing Turner Holdings' continued growth as the financial world adjusted to its true scope. Marcus's gaze fixed on the numbers, seeing in stark detail how small his supposed empire had been in comparison. "Victoria," he started again, "is no longer your concern," I cut in. "Her future career prospects will depend entirely on her discretion regarding certain matters. I trust she's intelligent enough to understand that." A notification appeared on my phone. another major financial publication requesting an interview. The story of Turner Holdings' revelation had evolved from scandal to case study, with business schools already developing courses around the strategic brilliance of the long-term deception. "Your mother called this morning," I mentioned casually. She was quite concerned about the family foundation's funding. I assured her that Turner Holdings would continue its support, though perhaps under more transparent management. Marcus flinched. Even his charitable works, the basis of his carefully crafted public image, had been built on my family's resources. Now he would watch as his mother's foundation flourished under its true benefactor's guidance. "The Milan team sends their regards," I added, enjoying his discomfort. "They're particularly impressed with how smoothly the integration is proceeding. Now that's certain. Distractions have been removed from the process." His hands clenched on the armrests. Every business relationship he'd thought was personal, every connection he'd believed he'd cultivated, was being systematically revealed as part of Turner Holdings' network. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible. "Why maintain the charade for so long? Why let me believe?" "Because my father taught me the value of patience," I replied, standing to assert my dominance. "He showed me that true power lies not in its display, but in understanding when and how to reveal it. You gave me the perfect opportunity at our anniversary dinner." I moved to the window, looking out over the city that had witnessed my transformation, from silent observer to acknowledged leader. "You thought you were humiliating your wife, replacing her with a younger, more ambitious model. Instead, you gave me the perfect stage for revealing who really controlled your precious company. The board members." He tried one last time. "They must have known." "They knew exactly what we wanted them to know," I confirmed. "Those who were loyal to my father's memory kept his secrets. The others." I smiled. "Well, they're learning the cost of backing the wrong Turner." I placed the divorce papers before him, along with a pen. Not his preferred Mont Blanc, but my father's vintage Cartier. "Your signature here will end our personal relationship. Your future employment prospects, what remains of your reputation, depend entirely on your discretion about the operational details you witnessed during your temporary position with the company." Marcus stared at the documents, the final evidence of his complete defeat. With trembling hands, he signed each page, formally relinquishing any claim to the life he'd thought was his. "Goodbye, Marcus," I said, gathering the papers. "Thank you for playing your part so convincingly. The role of ambitious, unfaithful CEO suited you perfectly." 1 month after the revelation that shook the corporate world, I stood in my father's office, my office now, watching the sun rise over the city. The morning light caught the edges of the Turner Holdings logo, now proudly displayed on buildings across the skyline. The quiet wife who had watched from the shadows had fully emerged into her power, and the business world would never be the same. "The final numbers from the Asian markets are in," Lawrence announced, entering with the morning reports. "Turner Holdings' true value has stabilized at triple what Marcus claimed during his last earnings call. The Financial Times is calling it the greatest corporate revelation of the century." I smiled, remembering Marcus's boastful predictions about company growth. How small his ambitions had seemed, how limited his vision. "And the European merger?" "Proceeding ahead of schedule. Charles Winston sends his compliments on the strategy. He says watching Marcus try to compete with him all these years while you quietly orchestrated everything was the finest chess game he's ever witnessed." The morning news played silently on the office screens, showing clips from my latest press conference. The story had evolved from scandal to legend, the hidden heir who had watched her husband build an empire on her family's foundation, only to reclaim it all in one masterful stroke. "Victoria has accepted a position in Singapore," Sarah reported, entering with fresh intelligence. "A minor consulting firm, well away from any Turner Holdings interests. Her social media accounts have been quietly archived. The woman who had thought to replace me had learned the hardest lesson about true power. It isn't in the display, but in the patient accumulation of influence. While she had plotted her social ascension, I had been operating on a completely different level. Marcus's lawyers have withdrawn their last attempt to claim company assets, Diane added. Apparently, the documentation we provided about his creative accounting practices was quite persuasive. I moved to my father's safe, now containing a new generation of Turner family secrets. Inside, alongside his original business plans, lay my own carefully crafted strategies for the company's future. The legacy would continue, but now in the open, under its rightful leadership. The board meeting is confirmed for 10, Lawrence mentioned. The members are particularly eager to review your 5-year expansion plan. Those who opposed Marcus's leadership have been generously remembered in the new structure. Loyalty, I had learned from my father, works both ways. Those who had kept our secrets, who had played their parts in the long game, would find their faith rewarded. The others would serve as object lessons in the cost of backing the wrong horse. The Turner Foundation's new initiatives are receiving excellent press, Sarah noted, displaying articles on her tablet, particularly the Women's Leadership Program. The irony of Marcus's mother now championing female executives hasn't been lost on anyone. The foundation had been transformed, like everything else, from a tool of Marcus's self-promotion into a genuine force for change. The same social connections he had cultivated for show would now serve a greater purpose. Charles Winston's daughter has requested a meeting, Diane mentioned. She's interested in learning about our management training program. Apparently, your revelation has inspired a new generation of female executives to think differently about power. I smiled, remembering my own journey from quiet observer to acknowledged leader. The lessons I'd learned, the patience I'd developed, would now benefit others who understood that true authority doesn't always announce itself. The penthouse renovations are complete, Sarah added. Every trace of the life you shared with Marcus has been replaced with your true preferences. The view of the city is quite spectacular. My new home, like my new life, would reflect who I had always been rather than who I had pretended to be. The careful facade of the corporate wife had served its purpose. Now I could live authentically, openly wielding the power I had always possessed. One last thing, Lawrence said, checking his tablet. The Ethics Committee has completed their review of the Marcus era. The report makes for interesting reading. Have it archived, I instructed, along with all documentation of the transition. Future business students will find it an invaluable case study in strategic patience. A message appeared on my screen, the London office requesting confirmation of their new reporting structure. The Turner Holdings empire was fully emerging from the shadows, its true scope and influence finally visible to the world. Your father would be proud, Diane said softly, placing a fresh cup of coffee, Brazilian blend, of course, on my desk. I lifted the cup, savoring the aroma that had always reminded me of mornings spent in this office, learning from the master of corporate strategy. He taught me well, I replied. The value of patience, the power of observation, and most importantly, the art of waiting for the perfect moment. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the city in golden light. Somewhere out there, Marcus was adapting to his new reality. Victoria was rebuilding her life on a much smaller scale, and the business world was still adjusting to the revelation of Turner Holdings' true power. But here, in the office that had always been my destiny, I was exactly where I belonged. The quiet wife had completed her transformation, emerging as something far more formidable. A woman who had orchestrated the greatest corporate revelation in history, all while those around her thought she was merely decorative. The future stretched before me, bright with possibilities. Turner Holdings would continue to grow, now guided openly by the hand that had always controlled its destiny. The empire I had protected from the shadows would flourish in the light. And the business. World would never forget how a supposed trophy wife had revealed herself as the true power behind the throne.